Welcome to the Green Urbanist Podcast, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Today's episode is a conversation with Conrad Richardson. You might remember Conrad from way back in episode 5 when he joined me to talk about transport planning, a bit about his career and his role and what the kind of work that he's up to. Well, 1 year on, he's back to talk about the work that he's currently doing in Southeast Asia on sustainable transportation and urban innovation. I have a feeling that this will be a long episode because we have a lot to catch up on. So I'm going to get straight in. Welcome, Conrad. Welcome back to the Green Urbanist. It's great to have you.
Hi, Ross. Yeah, great to be back indeed. As you say, I think it's been over a year since we recorded our first podcast. And well, things have changed quite a bit for me. In our last conversation, I was in Belgium at the time. And today I am very far from Belgium. I'm in hot and humid Cambodia. Today was 35 degrees and it's a late evening for me. So bear with me. My brain is a little bit foggy. But Cambodia, the kingdom of wonder. And sometimes I really wonder how I ended up here. I'm sure we'll get into that and much, much more.
Excellent. This is one of those episodes where I've done very little preparation because I feel like I'm a bit like the listeners. I just want to find out about what you're doing and have a good chat in that sense. So yeah, I think when people think of Cambodia, I'm not sure what they really think of. Maybe in Southeast Asia, the big kind of touristy places are like Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia. Cambodia is a bit like, whoa, what's that like? So how do you find daily life there?
How to compare it to those other places. It has a lot of resemblance to Vietnam and has its own very unique and distinct culture. I don't know the long history going way back, but they have some Hindu influence, a lot of Chinese influence, a lot of Vietnamese influence, and they were once a big empire of their own, the Khmer Empire. So also a very distinct culture.
Well, I guess the main question is what brought you there?
Do you want the fun version, the romantic version, the adventure version? Because it's quite a crazy story.
It sounds like it's all of those at once, isn't it?
I guess we can rewind to our conversation. It was maybe in June 2020. I'm not sure. The early days of COVID. In our last podcast, I sort of shared my life story, which is a story of a green urbanist gone global, I guess. While we were recording, I was laying low in Belgium. I was reliving with my parents because while on holiday in February 2020, I went to the Philippines. And this was really not a good time to go abroad, but I had a window of free time and I said, we've had minor pandemics before. This will be the same. So I decided to risk it. But while in the Philippines, the world quite suddenly went into lockdown. And like dominoes, country after country started shutting their borders. And while all this was happening, was on a very small, beautiful island in the Philippines with very little internet and no international airport. So I was very disconnected. It was great. It just wasn't the right time to be that disconnected. Surely enough, the global situation continued devolving, and I sort of found myself stranded on this little beach, living in a tent. As a place, it was probably a good place to be in a context of a pandemic, but I couldn't stay. The military was deployed, and all tourists had to go home. But there were too few flights from this island to an international airport, so I had to wait it out and just figure out what to do. But eventually, I got an evacuation flight to a bigger island, Luzon, where the capital of the Philippines, Manila, is. From there, after pitching my tent in Clark Airport and spending a couple nights in the airport in my little tent, I managed to get on the very last flight back to Dubai, which is where I had been living. Where my home was, my girlfriend was. And I think we spoke quite a bit about that in the last podcast. But I never explained this story because this has all happened shortly before we recorded. And I landed in Dubai. I couldn't enter the country because the borders were closed to residents. So I continued on to Belgium where my parents live. Sort of a blessing in disguise because I don't get to spend much time at home, at least not in the last couple of years. Yeah, without going into too much detail, I found myself out of work and I could never resume my work in Dubai, and I've sort of never been back since. But back to Cambodia. While we were recording our podcast, I was in the middle of several negotiations, trying to secure future employment that I could realistically do. And at the time, I was working for Blaze Transit. I was working for them remotely. It's a really interesting and innovative Canadian startup revolutionizing bus operations. Ross, you had Justin, the CEO, on the podcast. So I won't go into detail. Feel free to listen to that. And at the time, I was also in conversation with my current team leader, who's essentially, well, he's my boss, Joachim. And this is someone I met in Ethiopia. And I spoke about my work in Ethiopia in the last podcast. But anyway, he was in Ethiopia just for a couple of days delivering a training course to the local government that I was working with. And somehow we were put in touch and ended up going for a beer and a pizza. And we talked about probably buses and BRT. What else can an urbanist or transport planner talk about? But anyway, fast forward now to February 2020. The week before going to the Philippines, I went to the World Urban Forum. It's a UN Habitat conference that happens, I think, on a yearly basis. And it was in Abu Dhabi, so not too far from Dubai. And I decided to go down, and there I bumped into Joachim, my current boss. I think through this encounter, I re-entered his radar. Not fully sure. Maybe you can ask him. He would make for a great podcast guest. But anyway, fast forward to June 2020, after the whole Philippines ordeal, and just before we recorded our podcast, he reached out with this potential opportunity in Cambodia. And I was still sort of trying to understand the requirements and the whole logistics of it. And it turns out Cambodia was one of the only countries where I could reunite with my girlfriend. And it just so happened to be a really interesting project, almost perfectly aligned for all my previous project experiences. And so I went over to Cambodia to be a contractor on a GIZ project. And GIZ is the German International Cooperation. It's kind of like the World Bank of Germany, or the DFID that you have, DFID in the UK, or AFD in France. But GIZ is less focused on issuing loans for setting up projects, but more focused on international cooperation. I can make it slightly more clear the type of work we do as we go deeper into our conversation. But we focus more on capacity building, on skill building, and GIZ has a really interesting portfolio of projects all around the world. A lot of urbanism and transport-related projects included in their portfolio, and we can get into that as well. And anyway, shortly thereafter, after I was invited to take part in a project, I moved to Phnom Penh, the chaotic Cambodian capital. And I've now been here for 1 year. And again, I'm sure we'll speak a little more about Phnom Penh, this really weird and wonderful city.
Excellent. Yeah. I wanted to ask about Phnom Penh. What's the population?
I just pulled it up. It's about 2.3 million. But as you say, I don't know if it's the daytime population or nighttime population. There's a lot of daily rural urban commuters, but it's a relatively small city compared to the other Asian capitals like Jakarta, Manila, Bangkok, which are absolutely massive. I think they're all mega cities, whereas Phnom Penh is a little city, but a fascinating city nonetheless.
Yeah, it's funny when you put it in perspective. I guess 2 million is quite a lot in Europe, but quite small in Asia. So what kind of work are you doing then? Please just tell us. What would a German bank / capacity building organization, be doing in Cambodia? It's sort of something that I think people don't realize is a job you can do. So tell us what it is.
Sometimes people find it hard to grasp what exactly these types of organizations, the type of work they do. We're not consultants like you would find in the private sector. We're not an NGO. We are here without specific business intentions. We're not here to turn a profit, but we are here to promote certain concepts and practices. And the big agenda or the main focus of our specific project is to promote sustainability. The German government fully acknowledges that climate change is real and isn't enclosed by political borders. Therefore, it's in Germany's interest and everyone's interest to promote sustainable mobility. And, these are emerging countries and cities and they're currently booming. So it's a really good time to try to get things right. And
Right.
more specifically, the project I'm doing here is it's called the Summer Project, SMMR. It stands for Sustainable Mobility in Metropolitan Regions in ASEAN. It's an ASEAN-German cooperation governance project that is implemented by GFA Consulting Group on behalf of GIZ. ASEAN is sort of like the EU of Southeast Asia. ASEAN, the secretariat, is based in Jakarta, obviously not Brussels. And unlike the EU, they have less power and less influence. And within this ASEAN secretariat, they develop strategies and provide guidance to the 10 Southeast Asian nations, which, if you bring them all together, it has a huge population and represents the sixth biggest economy in the world. And these are, for the most part, rapidly developing countries. And so ASEAN also has an interest in transport and sustainable mobility related strategies. And through this project, the Summer Project, we support them, I suppose, both directly and indirectly. Directly, we draft guidance documents for them or with them, which are then disseminated to the national ministries of these 10 Southeast Asian countries. And then indirectly, we work with local metropolitan regions and city authorities to build capacity and also to set up projects, sustainable mobility projects in different metropolitan regions and cities. And I can give a couple examples later on.
Sure.
And our project, so the Summer Project, is quite unique and experimental compared to other GIZ and many cooperation projects I've come across. We have our own brand and identity, and that allows us to be a little more flexible with how we achieve our outcomes. And we get to come up with quite creative solutions to certain problems we need to address. So we obviously have a project brief, and there's very high-level indicators that we have to meet, and then we get to be quite creative in how we solve them. And I'll give some examples of the type of work we're doing. But at the center of what we do is really this capacity building on concepts that are widely applied in Europe and especially in Germany, quite obviously. So the project started in 2019. I joined in September 2020, so almost a year ago. And since the beginning, this project has been developing 4 knowledge products in the form of reports, webinars, videos, and use these to raise awareness, develop this institutional capacity, and train Southeast Asian governments. I can give you a quick rundown on these 4 knowledge products, what they are. And first of all, I'd like to apologize for the amount of acronyms I'm probably going to use when I explain what we do. Like any urbanist professionals, we are buried in acronyms, which makes our work quite cryptic, which is quite unfortunate. So first acronym is SUMPs. I don't know if you're familiar with SUMPs, but they stand for Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans. And these are concepts and frameworks that have been embraced by many European cities. I think even most medium to large European cities have a SUMP, and now they're being implemented worldwide. And it's quite a progressive framework or concept that helps cities and guides cities in planning themselves in a more sustainable way and is very focused around transport. And unlike a lot of other planning practices and master planning practices, these SUMPs, they look at the whole functional urban area. So they go beyond administrative boundaries. In emerging cities especially, growth happens beyond the city's boundaries. So that should be factored when you're planning your city. And they also factor all modes of transport, and they set out to meet the mobility needs of all users. So a SUMP is, I don't know how to describe it or what analogy I can use. It's sort of like a coach for a city. It's really there to guide you. It's not super prescriptive, and it provides a 12-step approach. And first, it starts by looking at what resources you have. Then you're prompted to think about what kind of city you want.
Okay.
Then you think of things like how you can track your progress towards creating the city that you want, what kind of concrete actions you can take, how these can be managed, and also post-implementation, what lessons can be learned from the things you've implemented. So that's really a super high-level overview, but it's something that is extremely important in ASEAN cities, because here there's often this lack of institutional coordination and alignment of plans at the local, regional, and also national level. So these plans sort of help bring everyone into the same room and align on the future of the city or the metropolitan region. So those are SUMPs.
That's really interesting, because I think the role of a transport planner or a transport engineer for much of the 20th century, and still in many places around the world today, is about the efficient movement of motor traffic, and that's caused, huge amounts of damage in cities with urban highways and basically designing cities so they're totally dependent on private car use. I'm sure the audience is listening to us doesn't need to be convinced about how the kind of problems that causes in the world, as well as the emissions. So this is a really interesting flip. And do you see people wanting to follow more the American model of urban highways, suburbs, that kind of thing? And is it a difficult mindset shift to start looking at, like, no, you have to think about cyclists, you have to think about pedestrians and micro-mobility and all these things as well?
It varies. We're talking about 10 countries here, and some are far more progressive than others. And at least in these countries that are less developed in an institutional sense or a governance sense, a lot of development is driven by private sector developers. And because of this weak institutional capacity, it's very hard to plan in a very progressive,
proactive sense.
Proactive sense, exactly. So some governments are very progressive in what they want to achieve, but they're not well equipped in how they can achieve it.
Right.
This SUMP concept is really there to step in and help solve some of these issues. And again, it's somewhat aspirational, but it's far better than business as usual.
And having some sort of plan is really the starting point, because then you can start going out to investors and saying, we know what we want, and hopefully get the private sector on board as well.
Exactly.
Okay, should we move on to your next point here?
The next acronym, MTEs, which stands for Metropolitan Transport Executives. Listeners probably have no idea what that means, but chances are you're very familiar with what they are. It's like a TfL, Transport for London, or RTA, or LTA style governance structure. So the RTA it's in Dubai, the LTA is in Singapore, and TfL is obviously in London. And these are governance structures which bring together, or attempt to bring together, all transport operators in a city together. So instead of having numerous competitors, 6 companies, same rules, which actually can work reasonably well in the short term. In the Philippines, or converted army jeeps into these minibuses, which are the main form of public transport. And they're really quite fascinating, but they're highly competitive with one another. There's a lot of independent operators or very small cooperatives. And in the medium to long term, they really start to have collectively damaging behavior and generally offer a poor service quality. So in these contexts, it's really good to develop this MTE, this Metropolitan Transport Executive, to try to rationalize and optimize these routes, and also to sort of centralize the transport budgets and finances, which makes it possible, or at least a lot easier, to develop big public transport infrastructure projects like BRTs and MRTs. And also, if you have a tram, a BRT, and MRT all in the same city, you ideally would like to have a unified smart ticketing system. And for that, you need to have some form of governance that manages all of this centrally. I suppose you could say that in the short term, these MTEs, they can be quite negatively disruptive on existing operators, but in the long term, they have numerous benefits, and the risks of not forming MTEs is far greater than having these MTEs. In the Philippines, they have what they call the PUVMP. It's the Public Utility Vehicle Modernizations Program.
Another acronym.
Another big acronym. And as part of this project, they're working on a BRT project, but they're also looking on how to formalize and sort of tidy up the jeepneys. So along certain corridors in Metro Manila, for example, where there's just back-to-back jeepneys, it's quite a logical location to put in a high capacity, much cleaner, much more organized BRT with designated stations. So the jeepneys right now, they stop everywhere and people jump on and off. It's quite chaotic, and they also pollute a lot. So it's looking at how we can re-rationalize the public transport operations, and in certain locations provide higher capacity modes of transport, and instead using the jeepneys as a feeder service to some of the key bigger stations. So that's one thing. As part of the PUVMP, they also have a micro loan program to help the old jeepney drivers upgrade to modern, I think they're Euro 4 or Euro 5 jeepneys. And by that, I'm referring to the engine standards, and also electric jeepneys. I actually I did a deep dive video on this specific topic, where I spoke to someone from the Department of Transport, someone from Clean Air Asia, an NGO, and a industrialist who's built the first electric jeepney. And he also built the Pope-mobile when the Pope came to the Philippines. It's a fascinating topic, and I have to say the Philippines is doing a great job. They have huge challenges, but they're not shying away from them, and they're being very progressive in many ways. And unfortunately, what they have to do is very negatively disruptive for many individuals, but you need to, at some point, find good solutions to these problems. And they're doing their best, but obviously the terms of the loans are not favorable for these lower income jeepney drivers, but they're not completely ignoring that this project is disruptive, and they're trying to accommodate as best as possible.
Yeah, that's it. That's interesting, isn't it? Because there is, I suppose, a human cost to these things. People have had a kind of informal market for many years, and then suddenly step in and starts getting more highly regulated. It's sort of not really their fault that they've been allowed to do something that maybe was not regulated enough for many years. I suppose there must be ways of integrating, I guess, the existing private sector stuff, but in a maybe more regulated way. It's a bit like Uber in London, where eventually they had to start getting registered and paying their employees, and like you have to come up to the standards that we expect of a transport provider, kind of thing. What strikes me about these two, the mobility plans and the Metropolitan Transport Executives, is that they're obviously European concepts, but actually there's plenty of cities in the UK that I've been involved in, local authorities, who don't have them either, and it's a huge problem over here where small, medium-sized cities don't have any control over their transport, and it's not jeepneys or anything like that, but it's private bus operators that are just not providing a comprehensive service, because it's not necessarily profitable to do that. And then of course you just get people locked into using their car. So it's definitely we're talking about the developing world, we're talking about Southeast Asia here, but equally we need these things to happen in our cities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these concepts don't trickle down to the medium-sized cities in the UK and in Europe, which is quite unfortunate. So the next topic acronym is ITS and open data. ITS is Intelligent Transport Systems, and that's sort of my bread and butter. It's what's my core topic as part of this project. And I spoke a lot about ITS in the last podcast, I believe, but I'm working on ITS from a governance perspective this time around, not from an engineering perspective. And to paint a clearer picture, a city generates so much data, and this data can be used to add value and to create new systems and services. And using this data, you can really optimize your whole transport ecosystem. But to do this effectively, you need certain governance frameworks to govern the thousands of hardwares and softwares that are required to operate your city. And this technology is invisible, but it's everywhere. And enables all our urban systems and services, whether we're talking about traffic lights, bus systems, all the apps that you use to get around. There's a lot of technology behind the scene that we take for granted. And so cities, ideally, they need frameworks. And these frameworks should be designed in a way that encourages and facilitates data sharing, interoperability, and integration of all this hardware and software. And if a city does that, they can easily scale and scope this technology in a way that allows for innovation. And what's happening in emerging cities is many emerging cities like Phnom Penh and many others are at a risk of developing closed ITS systems. So these are ITS systems that are gently imposed on them by a foreign entity. I'm not going to point any fingers, but it is happening around the world, where you have a foreign company, often backed by their government, who come to a city and they propose to develop, say, a traffic control center. So these, I don't know how to describe them, these James Bond looking rooms full of screens where you can sort of monitor and see exactly what's happening everywhere in the city, that plugs into all the cameras, all the sensors. So you'll have a foreign company come in and say, hey, we can build you a traffic control center and give you loads of cameras, and you'll be able to do this, this, and this. And these projects are multi-million-dollar projects. They're huge projects, and they're being offered for free. And basically in this center, you have all this hardware and software come together into one centralized platform. And this allows for central operations of the transport system, which is great in many ways. But the way it's done by these big companies is they are often companies with a very wide portfolio of ITS solutions. So they might have the platform for the control center, the CCTV cameras, the street sensors. They will have this broad portfolio that plugs into their system, but doesn't plug into any other system, and no one else can plug into their system. So by working with them, you end up in a situation which is known as vendor lock-in, where you can only work with one vendor and they can charge you whatever they want to keep building on the system that they brought in for either very cheap or for free, which is obviously quite problematic. There's very much strings attached with many of these projects. And this is unfortunate because it can hamper a lot of local innovation. So say this happens in Phnom Penh, and I'm not saying it is, it could happen here or any of the other cities in Southeast Asia where a control center like this is built. And then you have a local startup build a great solution that is perfectly tailored for the mobility needs, which are very unique in Cambodia. And they want to make it part of the operation control center where a lot of transport is managed, but they can't because the system is closed. So as part of our project, we advocate for creating open systems that allow for the sharing of data between different hardware and software, regardless of the manufacturer. So we're agnostic in that sense. We can interoperate and we can integrate. And if you do that, it may cost you more upfront, and it can be a bit more of a headache, but it creates that extra flexibility and it future-proofs your platform, which is, again, very important. So that's what we do in a governance sense. Another ITS topic we're developing is that of modeling and simulation. We recently formed a partnership with PTV Asia Pacific, which is a subsidiary of PTV Group. The first company I ever worked for, I spoke about them in the first podcast. It's a German company that develops these 3D modeling tools where you can sort of create a digital replica or you could call it a digital twin of what's happening in the real world in this virtual environment, and say, test the impact of adding a BRT lane or adding a cycle lane, all in a virtual environment at a much lower cost than obviously running a real pilot or developing a real project, which is quite fun. And we're working with them and trying to navigate the challenges of calibrating a tool really developed for German cities, European cities, the Western world, trying to calibrate a model for very different mobility system where driving is far less organized. And the vehicle composition is also very different. In Cambodia, we have 75% of the vehicles are two-wheelers.
Oh, right. Scooters, motorbikes.
Yeah, that move more like a shoal of fish than a car.
Not calmly staying in lanes going forward. They're sort of weaving around and
Oh, absolutely not.
how do you, that must be incredibly complex to try and model then, because you have to tell the model exactly how to behave, don't you?
Yeah. So we're still in the very early stages of this. This is planned for the next 3 years. But basically in the software, you have to switch off the lane abiding behavior, whereby motorbike who's driving faster will overtake on whichever side.
Okay.
And then when it comes to traffic lights, here on the ground, I have never counted. I would like to, but I'd say about 8 to 15% run red lights. It's completely normalized. If you can see that there's no policemen waiting on the other side of the junction, you go for it. So it's quite different. Yeah,
so different.
And that also has to be, well, in theory, it should be factored in the model if you want to make it realistic. Many city governments prefer not to admit that that's the reality on the ground.
There's a saying or a quote, I can't remember who said this, but they said, all models are inaccurate, but some are useful.
Something along those lines. Obviously, they're very much an approximation of reality. They have a lot of weaknesses, but what is the alternative? So we have to work with what we have. But at the end of the day, this is a scientifically valid and very powerful tool developed by engineers for engineers. So that explains the the 1990s graphics.
Well, it's amazing to be able to test a proposal before you build it, because it's something we don't really ever get a chance to do in urban design, or like if you're planning a development, you can build a 3D model, but then trying to understand the impacts of that are very, very difficult. It sort of comes down to like the systems thinking and systems dynamics. There's often unintended consequences of making an intervention, and so maybe to get a sense of what might happen through a model is just incredibly useful and essential.
Oh, absolutely. And so this one's not an acronym, but we write it as an acronym for some reason in this project. It's HUBs, which refers to multimodal interchange hubs. Yeah. And I think it's quite evident. These are basically nodes or stations, and they come big and small, and they're places where one can sort of interchange from one mode of transport to another, which is extremely important if you want to promote non-car based sustainable mobility, because it's great if you can take the metro or the tube to a certain station. But if that station is far from your end destination, you need to be able to interchange onto a different mode, whether it's a micro mobility scooter or a bus. You need these hubs. And these ideally should allow for smooth, safe, and seamless interchanging, and should provide the most dignified experience possible for users. Because if you don't do it well, then people will be more inclined to drive. So you have to make public transport as convenient and comfortable as possible. So these hubs, they exist at the intercity level. So going from Phnom Penh in Cambodia to Siem Reap, also in Cambodia. So you need hubs for these bigger buses where you go from city to city. And once you arrive in the new city, you interchange onto here. It would either be a tuk-tuk, or they have shared electric motorbikes that you could use. So we're trying to provide guidance on best practice to create these hubs. And again, you really need an MTE to make this possible.
Oh, yeah.
And you need governance structures, but also knowledge on how to effectively develop public-private partnerships. A hub is sort of like an airport. You have a lot of retail opportunities, advertising opportunities. So we're building guidance around this topic as well. Yeah, these are our 4 topics, and they all overlap in some way, shape, or form.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's so great to see real best practice guidance, coming through, because as same thing about these hubs and with the modeling, we still don't do it in everywhere in Europe or in the UK. So we are catching up, and we're sharing our experience with other countries that are growing much quicker than we are. I suppose maybe we touched on this a little bit already, but like, what's the risk of trying to translate European concepts over to like an Asian context, is it more of a, as you said, adapting the models to, these much different conditions, or is there just a different kind of mindset that you need? It's like, do you think there's anything you're missing, I suppose, by being a European rather than being a local?
The answer is yes, absolutely. These cities are very dissimilar in many ways. In Europe, just general behavior is different. Tarmac streets are for cars. That's just the way it is. Here in Cambodia, well, just downstairs from my building, all our streets are shared spaces, but none of them are shared spaces. So the street is used for transport, but it's also the marketplace. It's also a place where people play badminton if it's not such a busy street. So it's very different to Europe. And it's not necessarily good to parachute in foreign consultants like myself who come in and say, hey, we've got this cool concept that works really well in these European cities. You should try them out. That is a weakness. For me, it'll always be hard to overcome some of the cultural barriers. But I've been living and working in emerging cities for several years now. I have more experience in these types of cities. I have, for example, worked on non-motorized transport projects in Ethiopia, BRT projects in Bangladesh, and I have picked up many lessons on these projects that I can bring over here. So yes, I'm a Western foreign consultant, but the bulk of my work has been working in these emerging cities. And the same applies to my colleagues. We're on long-term missions here. So we have time to get to know the city. And I think we can speak about that in a couple of questions time. But yeah, there's some things I will never be able to overcome, and certain cultural values I'll never fully grasp.
I think starting from that position of knowing that is very, is the right way to do it, isn't it? Because you want to, that also gives you, I suppose, the mindset of saying, okay, I'm going to work with the client and I'm going to learn as much from the client as they'll learn from me. Which I always find working in somewhere that is quite foreign, I suppose, to our own experience. It also sounds like there are things there that are different, but maybe are important to preserve. Like you said, the fact that, now in the UK, there's lots of people campaigning for shared streets and for streets where people can play and that are multifunctional and are more like public spaces. It sounds like they already do that to an extent. Now, I don't know what the issues are in terms of road safety and things like that, but it sounds like there are aspects you would want to preserve as well. So please tell us maybe some more specifics of what are the actual projects you're delivering.
And as I mentioned before, we also work on projects that, in a practical sense, try to work around these concepts. And we work in 4 metropolitan regions, and we have 3 projects. And one of our projects that touches on, I suppose, the MTE and the hubs topic is a cross-border cable car from Vientiane, the capital of Lao PDR, country of Laos, you might know it as, over the Mekong River, so the international border, into Nong Khai, which is a border city in Thailand. And through our project, we developed a vision for this cable car. We looked at all possible options. This one seemed to be very well suited, and we've now sourced the financing for a project preparation study of this cable car to really appraise whether or not it's economically and technically viable, which is quite a cool project, because at this specific location, if we look at it at a macro scale, we expect huge growth. At this particular river crossing, there's also the Singapore Kunming Railway being developed, which is a high-speed railway all the way from Singapore to China that will pass pretty much next to this cable car proposal. And then at the more micro scale in Vientiane, the Laotian capital, they're building the BRT, and the cable car will have a terminus very close to both the high-speed rail and the BRT, and we'll have this hub that facilitates the border crossing. Because as of now, all they have is a small bridge that pre-COVID had reached its full capacity. Uh-huh. And you're going from Laos to Thailand, so there's also a switch from left-hand to right-hand driving.
Right.
Quite chaotic.
That must be tricky.
So the solution that we came up with after a lot of consideration and a lot of conversations with the local and national governments of both countries was this ropeway, this cable car concept that will sort of operate like an airport where you can come in with your luggage, you can get your passport checked, you can have your goods scanned to make sure that there's no smuggling of anything over the borders, and then you'll enter a cable car cabin. So it sort of operates like a conveyor belt, unlike an airport. And there's small cabins. It's good in a context of COVID. It also offers beautiful views, so it has a lot of tourism potential as well. And it just links up to all these other projects that are happening in the region. That's quite an interesting project, and quite a challenging project to mediate negotiations between two local and national governments. But that's sort of the purpose of our project, to facilitate these type of cooperative arrangements.
Brilliant, well done. I'm reminded of the cable car in London here, which links from the O2 Millennium Dome venue over the Thames to the north, and I think it was done for the 2012 Olympics. It's great. You can go. It's a beautiful view. It's a nice experience. It's quite expensive, but I'd read a report that apparently it still has no regular commuters using it because it doesn't really link to transport hubs. There's a tube station on one side and a light rail station on the other, but there's no reason why you would want to interchange between the two. You would just take the tube into London, or you take the light rail into central London. So it's one of those things where it's like a nice idea, but the location is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I've ridden on the London ropeway, and yeah, you arrive and there's really nothing to do on the other side. The time I went was as part of a university excursion with a bunch of urbanists, and we were talking about what went wrong. But otherwise, I never had a reason to go because it really doesn't link two places. And then real quick, in Vietnam, we're developing not a BRT, but a quality bus corridor and partnership, which is a step back in a sense. Vietnam was very keen on developing lots of BRT systems for their primary and secondary cities, but BRT doesn't seem to work well in these motorbike-dominated cities.
Why is that?
I think I spoke a little bit about it in the previous podcast. This is what I did my dissertation on. Motorbike and two-wheeled mobility, which dominates in Vietnam and Cambodia, provides really effortless mobility. And these cities have evolved around the motorbike, at least in Vietnam, since 1986, when they opened up their borders. This country got flooded with motorbikes. And since then, everyone has been going everywhere by motorbike. The land use has evolved around the motorbike. Walking, the most natural form of like human activities, is near impossible. So you build a BRT. How are people going to walk to a BRT station? You can't. You have to drive your motorbike. But you're already on your motorbike in a medium-sized city. You might as well just drive to your destination. So in Hanoi, the forecast ridership has not been met, which is a bit worrying. But the country still wants and really needs to provide higher quality public transport. In Can Tho, a city much closer to Cambodia than to Hanoi, but still in Vietnam, we acknowledged this and we said, okay, let's not build a full-on BRT. Let's cut the costs and build something more suitable. So we're looking at a quality bus corridor, which has all the features of a normal bus and only some features of BRT, and has a strong governance component where we're going in and, again, touching on the MTE topic, we're trying to bring together a lot of independent and small-scale operators and trying to formalize them and bring a bit of coherence to how they operate. And as part of this, we're also developing some supporting infrastructure, higher quality bus stations, unified ticketing, and these types of things. And in the next phase of our project, this isn't confirmed yet, but we might also explore ways to create hubs or micro hubs around the quality bus corridor stations where we integrate them with shared electric motorbikes or different modes of micromobility or bicycle sharing, so that when you arrive at your destination in this rather poor walking environment, you have a mode of transport, a two-wheeled mode of transport waiting for you that you can take to get to your end destination. We're increasing the attractiveness and viability of the project and increasing the station thresholds by adding this extra mode of transport.
I'm thinking about these cities that are sort of dependent on motorbikes. Motorbikes are obviously very inefficient with their fuel. Motorbikes and scooters are very polluting. Do you think electric bikes, electric scooters will play a role in at least reducing the emissions from those?
Electric mopeds and motorbikes are slowly emerging. It's not a topic I specialize in at an ASEAN level, but I've taken a lot of interest in electric motorbikes in Cambodia. There's a couple companies who sell electric motorbikes, and there's one company that offers a shared electric moped service. They're called GoTo. It's a Singaporean company that is using Cambodia or Phnom Penh as a sort of a test city. Phnom Penh has quite relaxed regulations, or I wouldn't say relaxed regulations, just a lack of regulations, which makes it a really good host environment for testing these mobility concepts that could otherwise be very hard to introduce and test in different cities. So this service is really perfectly suited for Cambodia. I've seen similar implemented in Europe. In Berlin, there's several shared electric motorbike services. In the Middle East, Beirut has one, for example. In North America, there's a couple. But I don't think those are the best host environments for such a service. But Phnom Penh is ideal. You find these little motorbikes. They're bright yellow, and you just unlock them with an app. And it's cheaper than owning your own motorbike, which is great. And it's necessary to break this necessity to own your own motorbike and to make private ownership optional and no longer necessary. So these are dotted out throughout the city. And in the future, when public transport services continue their operations, everything's been put on halt because of COVID. They're likely to integrate them with the stations, so you can do this last mile or first and last mile part of your trip. They're great. Noise pollution is a burden to my daily life and the daily life of many people in Phnom Penh. And mopeds with these little, almost like lawnmower engines, are much noisier than cars.
Yes.
So it's deafening. I've made a video on these shared electric mopeds. But the first scene, we're filming at one of the busier roundabouts. You can barely hear us talk.
Oh,
all you hear is the humming of motorbikes, which is a bigger problem than people realize.
Well, it has health implications. It's like air pollution. It causes stress. It causes physiological stress, as well as mental health issues. So I think that's something that will...
Oh, absolutely.
Alongside air quality, noise quality, or acoustic quality, I think will start to emerge as a more serious well-being concern as well in cities.
I do hope so.
Something that concerns me is that a lot of electric car and electric bike manufacturers put speakers in their cars because people are of course we're used to noisy vehicles and we listen for them when we're crossing the street. And so often if you have an electric car, it's totally silent. There's a greater risk of accidents with pedestrians crossing because they don't think a car is there. I think we might create, by adding speakers to get rid of that problem, we might be just, losing the opportunity to have a much more peaceful, much more pleasant city that is much quieter. So and I think we will eventually get used to not relying on sounds.
Absolutely. I think Dutch cities are known, and there's been several studies done to be much quieter. And I think you're just less stimulated. I'm completely overstimulated in this city. It's not good for my mental health, I'm sure, or not necessarily mental health, but general focus. If I cycle to my office when it was open, I would cycle 11 kilometers through the city. By the time I get there, I have made millions of micro calculations in my brain and seen all sorts of crazy things. I think we can get to that. We can talk a little bit about street life in Cambodia.
Yeah, because let's do that.
It's mind-boggling. So my projects are around ASEAN, but I'm based in Phnom Penh. It's awesome. It's a fun place to live. I do like it. It has an old French colonial city center, and the whole city sort of radiates out from this old market. And now there's not so many left, but there's nice old French colonial buildings that have been dotted around. Unfortunately, many have been destroyed. I'm not pro-colonialism, but I do like the architectural style that these buildings were in, at least compared to some of the placeless glass towers that has replaced them. And because of this French legacy, the street layout, it predates the car. Don't know when the French left. It was 1930s, 1940s.
Oh, okay.
So it's
Relatively
created this
recently.
really pleasant inner city center. At least it could be. The city has remained quite compact, which is good. Unfortunately, now it's really overrun with motorbikes and increasingly cars. I think the car growth rate is 11% per year. So complete gridlock is imminent. Give the city 5 years and the city won't be moving anymore.
Yikes.
With all that, there's no big overpasses and underpasses. It's a much more uniform grid, or ununiform grid, not quite like Manhattan, but nice big boulevards with blocks in between. And so with that, I can really cycle everywhere. I can't walk anywhere, but I can cycle everywhere. So besides all the pollution, air and noise pollution, it's a fun, enjoyable city to get around, which wouldn't be possible in Ho Chi Minh City, for example. You couldn't cycle. The city's too big. It's dissected with these big bridges and overpasses, underpasses, where it's engineered for higher speeds that you don't reach on a bike. Whereas Phnom Penh is still very manageable by bike. I am probably slower than a motorbike, but I'm faster than a tuk-tuk, which is good. And I think we mentioned this several times, but it's also a very motorbike dependent city. And if you come here, and I hope you can, you're going to be just blown away by the sheer number of motorbikes on the road that, as I said, they flow like shoals of fish. I don't know what the percentage is, but 75% of the vehicles that are registered are motorbikes. And they very much form the backbone of the economy and play a very important role in moving people and goods. And they cradle a very heavy responsibility. The city really depends on them. If you snapped your fingers and removed them, business would grind to a halt almost instantly. Because if you go about your day in Phnom Penh, you come across all kinds of businesses that operate off the back of motorbikes, or often adapted motorbikes. Like you have barbecue, I wouldn't call them restaurants, street food on wheels. The guy that will like cut your keys, he's got a motorbike and he's adapted it so he has a third wheel with a component where he has his little shop window, but on his motorbike, shoe fixers, banana sellers, where it's so hard to explain, but they build, I don't know, like a platform off the back of their motorbike where they hang up the bananas. And it's not like bananas in plastic packaging. They come from the countryside with fresh bananas still off the branch, and they balance them on both sides of the motorbike, sell them in the morning, and then drive back. And they also have remorques.
Incredible.
So that's the French word for trailers, une remorque, which they've used in the Khmer language. And it's basically a trailer for a motorbike, which you don't see much of in Europe. But these trailers themselves also come in all shapes and sizes, and they carry all sorts.
No, I don't think I've ever seen one.
In between the street blocks, there's a lot of, I wouldn't call them informal settlements, but definitely not planned settlements with very fine grain housing. So very narrow streets, and you have these motorbikes with these trailers carrying entire beds. I've seen motorbikes, entire trees, or a trailer that's got planks of wood set up. So it makes like a minibus with space for up to 12 people, just pulled by a motorbike.
Oh my God.
There's so much innovation happening off the back of these motorbikes. What else? I've seen motorbikes carrying motorbikes. The list is endless. I can only send pictures because it's hard to believe.
I'll try and share some of that on my Instagram because it's marvelous.
It's incredible. Building on this notion of very dense, compact, semi-informal settlements. In Europe, you have many cities trying to create the 15-minute city, which is a great concept. I really like it. And it's basically this idea that a person can reach all or most essential amenities within 15 minutes of walking or cycling, I guess. I'm not sure. But here in Phnom Penh, things will come to you that you didn't know you wanted on the back of a motorbike. Like, not in this apartment, in our old apartment, the ice cream seller, he would come ring his bell, and we would hear him from upstairs, and we'd go outside and get our little ice cream. But if the things aren't coming to you, you can walk or cycle. So walking is not convenient, but it's obviously possible. You just have to be on the side of the road or climbing over all sorts of obstacles. But I'd say here within not 15 minutes, but 1.5 minutes, you can find almost everything. But my old apartment was sort of a tower in the middle of an informal settlement. And within 1.5 minutes, I could get coffee, I could transfer money, I could get a haircut, I could buy a wedding dress, I could do all my grocery shopping, which is quite fascinating. But as an urbanist, I think that's great, but that's all unfortunately changing fast because like with anywhere in the world, if anyone has a bit of money come their way, they aspire to the car, and here they aspire to big SUVs. So there's a big uptake of SUVs. You also see many Priuses. That's good. It's a hybrid electric car. It's not ideal in spatial terms, but in terms of efficiency, as far as vehicles go, it's quite good. But you see them. They retrofit their Priuses to have 4 fake exhaust pipes at the back, which I find quite funny and quite ironic. So a lot of funny little things like that. But these guys are buying big SUVs, and if they have enough money, they move out to the suburbs away from this French colonial legacy. And they're building these huge gated communities with cookie cutter houses that look like Beverly Hills. I've never been to Beverly Hills, but I imagine it's like that. Just these absolute mansions, which is a shame. And it seems that that's the direction they're moving in. Our little project would like to not reverse this trend necessarily, but at least open their eyes to the mess they could create for themselves in the future if all these suburbs, car-based suburbs, develop. And that's how modern life looks. And everyone's driving a big SUV into the city center, then it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. The transport system just comes to a stop.
Yeah.
It's I can sort of empathize with those sort of ambitions when we were just talking about how chaotic and polluted and busy and overstimulating the city center is. So obviously people feel the need to move out to the suburbs where it's very quiet and you have your own space. And you can just, have that sort of personal space and freedom. So it's like, can we find a happy medium somewhere where we're not dooming people to very carbon intensive lifestyles and car ownership, but also give them, I suppose, a better quality of life. For those listening to the audio version of this, you can find the video of this whole conversation on Conrad's YouTube channel, which is Urban Dialectic. And there'll be a link in the description. Definitely have a look at it, all of his other videos, which cover similar sort of urbanism with a bit of travel kind of topics, which are really, really interesting and a really, really good mix. And also you have a great Instagram page. So, links to all that. And I think, if anyone who's found this conversation interesting will be interested to follow you as well. Huge thank you to you for coming on, sharing these stories with us. It's so interesting to see what is happening. Often the perspectives I get on this podcast are much more geared towards, the UK, Europe, the USA, North America. So it's great to have you come on and tell us what's happening on the other side of the world and what we can learn from it as well.
I've enjoyed doing these podcasts quite in an introspective way. Last podcast, I also had a number of listeners reach out and say hi. Which I think is really, really great and really nice. So thanks again, Ross. I think last time we called it urbanism therapy. we can stick to that. And I guess thanks for giving us urbanists this platform to speak.
My pleasure. My absolute pleasure. As I said, people can contact you or follow you at Urban Dialectic on Instagram, I guess also on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, all the usual social media platforms.
Marvelous. Okay, thank you so much.
This brings us to the end of the podcast. If you've made it this far, a huge thanks for listening in. This right here was my second appearance with Ross on the Green Urbanist Podcast. Do feel free to check out episode 5, where we had a much higher level and less dense conversation. What you just saw was the first ever podcast episode in video format. This is still something very experimental, so do please let us know what you think. Did you actively watch the podcast, or is this something you had running in the background? Your feedback would be greatly appreciated. And of course, if you have any questions or comments about the topics we discussed, feel free to write in the comment section below and we can get back to you. If you enjoyed, do consider liking the video and subscribing to the Urban Dialectic channel. And lastly, if you're not familiar with the Green Urbanist podcast, do check it out. Ross has had some truly fascinating guests and conversations. The podcast is available on all major podcasting platforms. And of course, if you enjoy it, do give it a positive review and follow the Green Urbanist on Instagram and LinkedIn. Have a good one, guys.